I'd like to thank you again for coming. And what I'd like to talk about is a little bit about the journey that Patagonia has undertaken over the past 40 years. I was one of the original employees. I started in 1973. So I have been involved with this process, and I as both a participant and as an observer, because I'm primarily a writer. So everything that was happening at the company was something that often had to write down in order to understand. I had to go through the process of trying to figure it out. I kind of like to start these talks with 3 quotes. And the first is from Ernest Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises. And one character asks another, he says, Mike, he says, how did you go bankrupt? And Mike says, oh, in 2 ways, gradually, then suddenly. And the second quote is from Aldo Leopold, who is the first major American conservation biologist. And his quote is, a thing is right when it tends to support the stability, integrity, and beauty of the biotic community. And what he means by that is by the natural systems that underpin everything, every other system we have, industrial, community, family. I love that quote, and it feels just right, but at the same time, everything we do in business tends to disrupt the stability, integrity, and beauty of the biotic community. And the third quote actually comes from a book on fly fishing in Montana. And there's a character in it who's an old Presbyterian minister who's the father of the main character. And I don't know if any of you have tried to fly fish, but what happens if you're new at it, if you're just trying, is you take the rod and you tend to snap it back and then snap it forward. And what happens is you don't land anywhere near where the fish is. You strike at the water or you catch the line in your ear. And I've done it. and what you need to do in order to fly fish is you need to draw it back and pause. And the line goes all the way back, and you kind of wait, you can't see it, and you cast it forward. And that pause sends the line right to where you want to catch the fish. And the line of the old man, the old Presbyterian minister says, mankind has always tried to attain power without recovering grace. And I think this is a metaphor for our lives and for our time. That in business, in everything we do, we have attained a certain power over nature and natural forces that is now destroying the capacity of nature to live. It's also undermining our relations with each other and our communities. And it's the task of us now, and it's not a short-term task. It's going to be, this is a 30-year, this is a 2-generation task to really look at what we do to make our living and to change the way we live in order to allow nature to restore itself. I talk a lot to students, and one of the things I try to point out when we talk about the need for long-term change, that sometimes seems very abstract. But when I talk to students, I try to point out, okay, when I started working, 1973, it's not so long ago. It's the world population was 4.3 billion, and now the world population is 7. And when my students, who are graduate students, so they're in their late 20s, by the time they've worked as long as I have, the world population will be 9 billion. And another 1, 2, or 3 billion people will leave the farms and leave a subsistence life, often a disrupted and impoverished subsistent life, to join the middle class. The other significance here is that the size of the global economy is 5 times what it was in 1973. So the population hasn't quite doubled, but everything that we make has quintupled. It's 5 times what it was. Another thing I think that's one of the things that's very different from the lives of people who are 30 now and from my own life is that when I grew up in the early 1970s in places that are now regarded as having very good laws for clean air and clean water in Europe and in the United States and in Japan, those laws didn't yet exist. And in 1973, if you drove to Los Angeles from Patagonia headquarters, it's 100 kilometers away, and you drove to Los Angeles in August, your eyes would burn and you'd start to cough because the air was so bad. The Cuyahoga River that ran through Cleveland, Ohio, used to catch fire with some regularity because of the chemicals of it. And my favorite story is that in Lake Ontario, you could develop black and white film by dipping the film into the water. You wouldn't get a very good image, but the chemicals were close enough that you would get this. So we passed some very important laws in the early 1970s to clean up the worst of the smog and the worst of the air. And you have to go now to the third world and to the south. You have to go to Beijing, you have to go to India to get air as bad as we had in Los Angeles in 1973. And yet, that hides from us the fundamental problems that exist with the environment. Because every major indicator of environmental health has declined since 1973. It's just harder for us to realize it all at once. The first is so abstract, is so difficult to see, is the disappearance of species. And the richness of species, the number of species that can live in an ecosystem is a guarantee of health against forces that, a famous example is antibiotics. You know, antibiotics, if you reduce the resistance of the bacteria, then they overcome the antibiotics and they develop a new way to act. The richer the ecosystem, the less certain strains in the ecosystem can take over. But this is a huge long-term deal. We started to affect the balance of life 10 years ago when we started to farm. We started to have another huge effect on the natural systems 250 years ago when we started to have factories. So it's hard to think about. The second thing that's hard to think about is climate change, because it's a long-term process. We know it's happening when we see a major American city lose half its population from a storm, as New Orleans did in 2005. This is significant because it will change where everything can live. The third big deal is water. We think of oil as a non-renewable resource, but water is becoming a non-renewable resource because a lot of it is stored in underwater aquifers below the ground that are being depleted for our farms and for the development of our cities. Colorado River is the major river in our area in California, no longer meets the sea, and none of the major rivers in China will meet the sea by 2020, is what the scientists predict. And then the last major problem, there are like 9 different what are being called planetary boundaries that we're either getting close to exceed or we have gone over the mark. But another really important one is the oceans, which have been our friends for 250 years because they have been absorbing the extra carbon from our factories. And they can no longer do that. So they're turning acidic, which reduces the ability of the smallest organisms to grow the hard shell they need to survive. And that, in turn, threatens the whole chain of life in the ocean. And then the last one is soil erosion. All of this, so if I'm a climber and I go to the Alps and I go back to a place where I climbed 2 years ago, I can see that a glacier has shrunk. If I'm a fisherman off the coast of Massachusetts, I know that the cod are completely gone and that it takes me another 2 hours to run my boat out to get haddock. But if I'm an ordinary citizen in a city going about my life, all of this becomes really hard to see. And what we don't see, we don't know. And what we know that we don't think we can do anything about, we tend to look away from. It's a quality called cognitive dissonance in psychology. That if you don't feel your agency or your power as a person to do anything about something that's wrong, you look away. I think that at Patagonia, this process was no different for us for many years than it was for any other organization. The only thing that made a difference for us from the very beginning is that most of the employees in the very early days were climbers and surfers. And they had this strong sense, if you're a climber and you get a kilometer from the road, you have this strong sense that you're no longer at the top of the food chain. You're no longer, the human beings are no longer invulnerable. You feel vulnerable to weather, to big animals. You have a sense of awe that where you are is more beautiful than anything humans can make. And for surfers, the same thing happens when you just get a little bit away from the sand and you're dealing with the force of wind and waves and actually playing with that. You're exercising your humanness, playing with those forces. All of that leads to this extraordinary desire to protect those places and an extraordinary reverence for that experience that is very difficult to explain to anybody who hasn't had it. But if you've had that experience, you have a strong bond with other people who have. So this was in 1985, as early as 1985, Patagonia started to give 1% of its sales to environmental causes. And that was easy for us, I think, because we gave to very small groups, grassroots groups who were working to protect a particular patch of land or stretch of water that they really loved. It was much harder for us. It took a lot longer to look at our own practices as a company. We didn't think that we had any responsibility or any agency for what we did as an organization to the planet ourselves. We didn't even think nature was anything but Yosemite or Rincon or wherever people went to play. There's an incident Emo has written about in his book. And, the first time things really came home to us that nature was where we lived. We have a river right outside our headquarters that flows into the ocean. And this river has been degraded for a long time. It's polluted, has a big dam. And so the authorities came in and they said, here's what we're going to do for your town. We're going to declare the river dead. And because the river is declared dead, we're going to encase it in concrete, and you'll never have to worry about flooding. You'll never have to worry about this river again. It's gone. So the local community, oh, great, no problem. You know, this sounds great and good to us. Let's go ahead. And at the end of the meeting, a 25-year-old biology student gets up and says, oh, wait a minute. He says, I've been studying this river. And he showed 40 slides of different species of birds and insects and frogs that depended on the river for their life. He showed a couple of old slides of old fishermen from 40 years before with steelhead that were hanging from a pole this size. And he had seen 3 smolt of these fish, 3 baby fish, still in the river. And that one presentation led the local council to say, no, we don't want to encase this river in concrete. We want to restore it to life. So that was the first indication to us, oh, nature isn't there, nature is here. Another indication for us that nature was here came in 1988 when we opened our 3rd store in Boston. And beautiful store, we were getting going, and after 3 days our employees start to call in sick. They've got stomach aches and headaches. Call in a guy to fix the ventilation. And he says, you're good. We said, well, what happened? And he said, oh, it was formaldehyde off-gassing from the cotton clothes stored in the basement. So that was the first indication we had that the clothes that we designed and sold under the Patagonia label could have an environmental impact. And we did a study of our 4 major colors, which were polyester, nylon, wool, and cotton. We suspected polyester and nylon to be the most harmful because they're oil-based. But it turned out that cotton was the worst because of the intensive use of chemicals to grow cotton. We looked at this and we thought, oh my gosh, is there an alternative? And yes, there was an alternative because organic cotton was still grown at that time in California, Texas, Turkey, China. Does anyone want organic cotton? No. Does anyone want to pay $5 more for an organic cotton shirt than a non-organic cotton shirt? No. But we looked at what the implications of that we had this serious problem and that we could make a change. And we said, no, let's make the change to organic cotton. We'll simplify the line. If we offer 2 lines, one of organic cotton and one of conventional that's cheaper, this organic won't succeed. Let's make the commitment. Now the interesting thing is that we knew that there was enough organic cotton in the San Joaquin Valley to supply all of the shirts and pants and shorts that we planned to make. We prayed for rain for the San Joaquin Valley for that season, but we knew that they could grow enough. But what we soon discovered is that what we didn't know about our own business began to hurt us, because when it came to separating the fiber from the seed and the oil in this cotton, the ginners refused. This is cotton ginning. They refused to deal with us because they had to clean their machines too often. We took it to a spinner who takes the fiber and makes it into yarn. And they said, no, we don't want to deal with this because it gums up, it's sticky, the organic cotton, and it makes our machines not work. So we went through this whole process. Our employees who have big jobs, they already have, to design a line of clothing for a particular season, they have to produce it. And all of a sudden we're saying, oh yeah, And what you want, go ahead and do your regular job and find us a whole new infrastructure to make sportswear at the same time. Just do it it'll take a few extra hours every day. So they started to revolt. What we did is we rented a couple of buses, or we rented several buses, but we took employees 30 or 40 at a time to the San Joaquin Valley, to a conventional cotton farm, and to an organic cotton farm. And when they got out of the bus at the conventional cotton farm, the air actually stank of the chemicals used to grow the cotton, used to for pesticides and insecticides that were developed for nerve warfare. There were no birds, there were no bugs, there was no ground cover. And when they went over to the gym, they noticed that the cotton was being separated into fiber and also being separated into cottonseed oil that goes into almost all processed food and goes to children, even though it had all this chemical. So nobody ever came back from one of those trips and said, this isn't worth it. Everybody came back from one of those trips and said, listen, the company is doing the right thing. This is a pain, but this is something we've got to do. And two things happened for our business as a result. First of all, we learned more about our business, so we became better designers. We became better negotiators with our factories, because we actually understood the sportswear business and didn't rely on others to do our work for us. Second, we had a much more committed workforce, because when people get to do the right thing at work, they get very committed to the company that is allowing them to do and encouraging them to do the right thing at work. When you can engage your soul at work, it's something, an opportunity you don't want to give up very soon. So that kind of transformed our company. I wanted to talk a little bit about what we see after 40 years of work. I mean, we've done a lot of things since we came up with organic cotton. But a couple of things we saw that we've learned over time is that one company there's a limit to what we can do on our own. And it really makes a difference to start to work with other companies to reduce the harm we do to the environment, especially if you're in an industrial system, as Patagonia is, industrial production of clothing. You want to make changes at the industrial level. So we started in 2010, actually, with Walmart as a partner, which was kind of unusual friendship. We started an organization called the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. We invited 15 CEOs of big apparel companies to come to a meeting in New York and to talk about improving environmental and social standards for the production of clothing. And that group has grown. It's now over 100 companies who make more than a third of all the clothing and footwear sold in the world, and working in thousands of factories to actually reduce greenhouse gases there, to reduce energy use, waste, and water use. And the second thing, and more importantly, is to identify what are the more environmentally friendly processes that designers can use and they can then put into clothing, and to put that into companies' computer systems so designers know when they're designing. And then the third thing, which hasn't happened yet, is to develop a consumer-facing index so that you can take your cell phone and put it up against a hang tag on a pair of jeans and get an environmental and social rating that applies across the board. So you can look at a pair of Levi's, you can look at a pair of Patagonia pants, or a pair from someone else, and the same criteria apply. That's important, but it's also important, we feel very strongly, it's important to start to have more business developed on a local scale, and more business, the communities need to exercise their citizenship, not just leaving it to the federal government or to the state government, but to keep it as intimate as possible, because when you're facing your neighbors, when you're talking about environmental decisions within a watershed, it's a lot more real. It's not abstract. Time and again, I've seen small entrepreneurs who want to act better socially and reduce environmental harm. When they get together in their communities and talk about what they're doing and start to act on behalf of the community, they make changes that people who don't do that don't do. There's an interesting, people ask us a lot and say, well, you're Patagonia, you're privately held, you're weird. You've done what you've done, but nobody else can do this because nobody else has developed this culture. And I think that that's really not true. I think it would have been very difficult for a publicly held company to do a lot of things that we did. But I really think that we did what we did first because of the culture of the company. That once we made that change to organic cotton, our people knew that they could, A, identify a harm. If they saw something that was harmful, could identify a change that could be made, they knew they could communicate it. We knew we could bring, if we treated our customers as friends and adults, we could bring them along. And I think this is a lesson for all companies who are interested in doing this work. It's just something, you just take the first step and keep going. And you will keep going in the same sense that a runner wants to improve his or her time, in the sense that a climber wants to climb a more difficult route. The other thing is that people ask about what's the financial payoff, or do you do the right thing? You're doing well, and you're doing good. How do you do this? Can you decide as a business strategy to do the right thing and plan to build your business along those lines? And the answer is yes and no. The answer is if you actually do the right thing, in our case, and Yvon Chouinard, our founder, has famously said he makes money every time he does the right thing. Yeah, but that comes from an increase in devotion from the employees. It comes from respect and devotion from the customers. It comes from respect from the community. So it comes from doing things for the right reasons. And if we went out and actually tried to build our business by saying, oh, we're now going to make Ulex swimsuits, or Ulex wetsuits rather, out of this material in order to gain market share in the wetsuit business, I don't think we would succeed. I think we would lose our credibility. But in fact, because we do try to create a wetsuit out of a less environmentally harmful material, again, we learn more about our business. We gain trust from our customers. The last thing I wanted to mention is that when you talk about doing this kind of, and then you talk about go back a second. There's a lot of talk about whether you can sustain a business financially if you're also pursuing social and environmental goals. And the fact is that if you want to be successful in business and pursue these social and environmental goals, it does work, but it works in the long term. It doesn't often work in the short term, where a company will sometimes have to give up a profit if it does want to do the right thing, but it doesn't have to give up that profit for a long time. Even in something very simple like the construction industry, which is very conservative. The commercial construction industry throughout the world has started to improve its environmental standards by examining the amount of time the investors will allow to earn their money back. And if they allow a little extra time to earn their money back, they understand that they make back more money if they build greener buildings. And this is true of a lot of business. And this is something that's going to be a big switch in business culture, which is still oriented very much toward quarterly and annual profit. We need to take the longer view. So the last thing I would like to say is that if awareness comes gradually, then if bankruptcy comes gradually, then suddenly, I think also awareness comes gradually, then suddenly. And then a lot of the things that you're thinking about because you've come to this conference and that you may feel are not in the mainstream of discussion about society and business. I think these things are going to be at the heart of what we're all thinking and talking about very soon. And that the work you do to help bring this about will be extraordinarily helpful to your entire community when they begin to see the importance of getting this work done. So, thank you.